work together in concert. But I was also asked to talk about sort of one of the most challenging issues we face, which is how to deal with the weapons that are being used to kill people all over the world right now. Small arms and light weapons. So these are things like AK-47s, hand grenades, small shoulder-fired missiles, little jeeps with guns on the back of them. These conflicts are not being fought. There's usually, at any moment, as many as 24 wars going on around the world. People aren't using tanks, they're not using fighter planes, they're not using aircraft carriers, they're not using all this big, expensive stuff. They're using these light weapons, many of which are left over from the Cold War. They're being recycled. They're not that expensive in terms of what weapons cost. They're easy to move around if you're a rebel group or an irregular army, and they're plentiful. And as the world's leading arms exporting nation, as I mentioned, the United States should take the lead in trying to cut off this trade. And I think in order to cut it off, I think we have to understand a little bit about how it works. During the Cold War, a lot of the weapons sales were by big governments. The United States and the Soviet Union were the biggest suppliers. They often supplied allies of theirs in proxy wars around the world. Also, they would supply non-state groups, as Ronald Reagan did with the Contras in Nicaragua. But the main point was that there were governments were the main sellers, and if they wanted to, they could exert some control over the trade. Now, it's much more open-ended. You have rebel groups in Africa, for example, who will capture some territory using small amounts of small arms. They will kidnap kids, put them to work as child soldiers. They will loot timber and diamonds and gold and sell it on the black market, thereby buying more arms, then controlling more territory. Before you know it, they've got these little fiefdoms that the warlords are running on their own. Not countries, but kind of almost little tiny countries that they've created through violence. And so with that kind of approach, much harder to control. It's not just like you have to get a couple governments to do the right thing. You've got to create a whole network to try to stop this from happening. And stop it, we have to stop it. I mean, if you think about what happened in Rwanda, for example, the genocide there in the 90s, hundreds of thousands of people were killed over the course of a few months using nothing larger than an assault rifle, machine gun, or hand grenade. By some estimates, more people were killed in Rwanda during those few months than died from the bombings in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So some of the activists who work against small arms talk about them as slow-motion weapons of mass destruction. Without being checked, without political checks and balances, they can do unbelievable damage to human beings. So the question now is, how do we get a handle on this? And I think there's been a couple useful approaches that we've taken. One is to try to take some of the money out. And there's been a couple campaigns. There's been a campaign against blood diamonds. The diamonds that are sold by rebel groups have been sold in places like Sierra Leone by the rebels who were maiming and killing people. In the Congo, it's diamonds, it's copper, it's all manner of minerals being sold on the black market to create arms for these rebel groups. So the first effort was to identify where these diamonds were coming from, so that if you wanted to boycott diamonds coming from a conflict zone, you had the information to do that. And that has made some progress, and a lot of activists have worked on that. They've even got the diamond industry somewhat involved. And then there's a new effort that was part of the Dodd-Frank financial regulation bill that would do the same for other minerals from conflict zones, including something called coltan, which is used in cell phones and computers. So they put pressure on companies like Apple and others to say, we're not going to use material from these conflict zones in our products. So that's one angle that people have taken, is to try to block the finance, make it harder for these groups to get a hold of the money that they use to buy the weapons. The other thing is to go after the dealers. And I'm happy to say that early next year, Victor Bout, one of the most notorious small arms dealers in the world, is going to go on trial in Manhattan on criminal charges for gun running. But it took years and years for this to happen because regulations around the world are not coordinated. Laws are different in different countries. Some countries don't extradite a dealer. different kinds of evidence is needed in different places. So he ran guns to Sierra Leone, to Angola, to the Congo, to the Taliban, to Al-Qaeda. He had his own sort of little air force. He had money laundered in many countries of the world. He had his own ships running under false flags. He was bribing heads of government. But finally, after years of pressure, law enforcement actually arrested the guy. He'll be one of the first major dealers to finally go to trial. But obviously governments need to do more than that. One dealer at a time is not going to get the job done. So going back to 2001 through the United Nations, governments have talked about transparency. How do you figure out where these weapons are coming from? Better law enforcement coordination. Dealing with some of the, what banks help these dealers move their money around. But finally, after doing that for many years, it was decided, these kind of voluntary political agreements among governments are not enough. We need a binding treaty that says governments have to do everything in their authority to stop these light weapons and small arms from going to human rights abusers, from going into these war zones. So that's now under discussion at the UN. There was a meeting last summer. It's not going to be easy. They need some sort of consensus, but it's on the table. It's a real discussion now. Whereas 10 years ago, there was no sense that you would ever get the UN to take up this issue, given all the other things they had on their plate. And there's reason to think that we can be successful. If you look at things like the Treaty Against Landmines, that was put together with the help of governments, but also this massive network of citizens organizations. There was arms control groups that help the handicapped, there was the Red Cross, there were development groups. There was a whole array of groups working on a wide range of different issues. All of them said, these landmines are a huge humanitarian disaster. Because not only do they kill people during wars, but they're left over. So that after the wars, sometime decades later, people will step on unexploded mines. It keeps people from sowing their fields. It blows off legs of kids and so forth. So this citizens movement, working with some sympathetic governments, managed to get a global treaty. And sadly, our government has not signed it. But thanks to Patrick Leahy, the senator from Vermont, we no longer export mines. And our government spends a lot of money helping to clean up minefields. So this norm has been set that landmines are not acceptable. And this was through citizen action. And then the other example is cluster munitions. Cluster bombs are one of the kind of most vicious and deadly weapons that we have. Basically, it's a single bomb that opens up, and hundreds or thousands of small bomblets are spread over a large area. So if you're present anywhere near where one of these things goes off, you're going to be killed or you're going to be maimed. But then after that, many of these bomblets do not explode. So they're left over in the dirt. And they look, in some cases, like they're small. They look like a soda can, or, like some of them are painted yellow. There's been cases of kids picking them up thinking it was some sort of toy and having their arms blown off. Some places where people can't till their fields because there's so many leftover cluster munitions. So there was a campaign similar to the campaign against landmines, which now has put together a binding global treaty to limit the production, export, and use of those weapons. So each of these things happen in a relatively short time, in the context of the kind of fights that we have. The small arms issue really only came on the UN's agenda in 2001, so it's been about a decade. So given what's been accomplished already on landmines, on the cluster munitions issue, I think we can make progress on this, especially if we can keep together the kind of broad coalition that we had for the landmines movement and to fight cluster munitions. So I don't want to minimize what we have to do, but I think it's important to remember that we can do it. And we've done it before, that people can make a difference on these issues, and that it's not just also big and impossible and hopeless if we work together. And I think particularly now, given all the different trends in this country and our world, this is a time to pull together. But when I think about when I was a student and post-student in the Reagan period, I thought, oh, this is hopeless. I mean, we've got this guy in office, he's practically going to push the nuclear button. And by the end of his administration, he was talking about getting rid of nuclear weapons. Now, a lot of that was because of people taking a stand.